I'd like to, again, welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled SBIR STTR Feasibility Project Scope. So what exactly does an SBIR STTR project look like? The concept of this webinar is to give those who are early in the process or more unfamiliar for the most part with SBIR and STTR to better understand what the scope of a project looks like. Last week we held a beginner's webinar for SBIR STTR, which covered the overall basics of the program. So we're not going to cover a lot of those details on the background and agencies, and although we are going to give a quick 5-minute intro tutorial at the beginning of the session here to get any of those who might be still a little bit new to the program who were not able to attend last week, to kind of get you up to speed, so to speak. My name is Robert Brook. I'm the Director of Federal Funding Programs here at the Center for Innovative Technology. CIT is a state-funded nonprofit here based in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Our entrepreneur division is mostly the division that works primarily with early-stage technology companies. We work exclusively with companies in the Commonwealth. However, we certainly allow and invite other companies from outside of the Commonwealth to attend our workshops and training and things like today's webinar. Our GAP fund is an investment seed fund that invests in early-stage Virginia-based tech firms, and it provides a seed stage fund to leverage additional outside private capital. It typically provides up to about $100,000 investment to help a company do a lot of what the SBIR program can do, but probably a little bit further down the line to help vet out additional risk so that the likelihood for additional follow-on venture capital is more likely. So if you have any questions about our GAP seed fund and would like to maybe inquire with one of our investment directors, please let me know. I'm happy to get you in contact with one of them to have a further discussion. The program I manage is the Federal Funding Assistance Program, to which today's webinar is part of. We, again, work with Virginia-based technology firms in their efforts to secure early-stage federal grants, mostly with the SBIR and STTR grant programs. We provide training like today's webinar, other full-day workshops, 2-day workshops. We do one-on-one mentoring, proposal development assistance, and we also provide links to other third-party resources, Phase 0 awards, and more. So for those of you who are in Virginia, haven't worked with me yet, and would like to work with me to help you in your next proposal submission, let me know. The further notice that we get is the best. So we typically like to have at least 2 months of engagement time before we can, before submission date. We have other upcoming training. January 16th is a new webinar that we've created that's going to talk about building teams. This is a big issue with startups, spin-outs from universities, or just small companies in general, on how do you represent your startup or your very small company with not a lot of background, not a lot of history. How do you represent your team as a successful team or as a high-quality team? And so we're going to talk about that. So it's good for even those who may not be applying for SBIR to really know how do you highlight the pros of your team and the experiences you've had, as well as using outside consultants, building advisory boards, mentoring, that sort of thing. So we encourage you to register for that if you have not already done so. On January 30th, we'll continue with part of this 4-part webinar series that will end with the January 30th commercialization planning webinar. We'll talk about what goes into a plan, mostly focusing on the Phase 1 level. However, you can use that as a base to then further develop for your Phase 2 proposals. Talk about what goes into one, what the various expectations are from the different agencies for commercialization plan in Phase 1. So very important because SBIR commercialization planning is the crux of the program that makes it much different than other grant programs. And then we do have a live workshop planned for February 19th through 20th in Richmond, Virginia. We'll be focusing on the National Institutes of Health SBIR and STTR program. So there's a 1- and 2-day option for registration for that. So we encourage you to look at our website or ask me if you have any questions about if that workshop would be applicable to your needs. That's my contact information. Again, we will also follow up today's webinar with an email, so everybody will have my email directly as well. And a little bit, I want to talk quickly for just a couple minutes about the founding principles of SBIR, so we know where to, when I provide an introduction to today's speaker, you kind of get make sure you have a basic understanding of SBIR to kind of catch you up or to refresh you. The SBIR program was founded in the early 80s by the National Science Foundation. It was specifically designed to address the lack of funding for early stage technology companies that are developing those high risk but high payoff new technology solutions. And the concept was that there was really a lack of funding because of the early stage nature, the high risk nature of a startup company, and where the idea was, it wasn't proved out yet. So venture capital firms, seed investors, angel investors, and banks and other funding sources, it was just too early for them to get in without some risk reduction activities taking place. So that's where the agencies come in to basically be that funder of the first funding in, so to speak. You be your first funding investment partner. Now this is non-dilutive funding, so you do not owe it back, which is the great part of it, but it also provides leverage for that other follow-on funding sources down the line. Your project must fit the mission of the agency. Each agency has its own mission and own reason for existing. So you really need to think about that, and we talk about that in a little bit last week's session, and we talk about that certainly during the all-day workshops that we have to really fully understand what an agency is in business, so to speak, for. And that can lead into implications on the level of risk they like, whether or not they're going to be a buyer of the technology or not a buyer of the technology, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today as well. So you, for those new to the program, you do respond to federal agency solicitations. They come out between 1 and 3 times a year by each agency. Some agencies, smaller ones, only have 1 cycle a year. The larger ones have multiple, and we will add everybody to our monthly federal funding newsletter, so you'll be informed when those cycles are coming out, and I can certainly direct you to other websites as well for additional information on that. The key differences in SBIR compared to other federal funding programs is that this is not just funding for research. It's research that's trying to go somewhere, and if you're coming from an academic world, this is not academic research. This is funding for early stage, high risk, high payoff technology development that meets the mission of the agency, and you can describe where it might be going, where it might be fitting, where it might be commercialized, which means you need to talk about customers, competition, and all those other commercialization factors that are going to be a pathway to market, other funding needed down the line. So it's not just the early stage part. Even in a phase 1 proposal, you got to talk about all 3 key parts to the proposal: your team, the project, the research you're going to do, the feasibility that you're trying to prove, and then and your sound commercialization strategy. So those are the 3 keys, and must be addressed in any phase 1 SBIR proposal at different levels, and each agency does have its own sort of nuances in those areas, but however, you need to really talk about that, because those 3 things are what makes SBIR a lot different than most other funding. So, and again, it's for early stage research, things you don't know that work yet. So that's the key. So we will be sending out a copy of today's proposal to everybody after the presentation is done today. If you have a question, the mics are all closed today. Please use the question button that should be displayed on your screen there. You can submit an email question. I will, not an email, but a question via the GoToMeeting package that you have here. I will then relay that question to today's instructor, and we'll try to answer it at the appropriate time. If for some reason we are running late on time, or the question is too involved, or we've already answered that, we can delay the answer to that to the end of today's session, or in additional follow-on one-on-one discussions with myself or the instructor. So please bear with us as we do that. You will have a chance to follow up with myself and today's instructor via email. We do encourage you to not ask too in-depth, detailed questions. If they're just clarifying things or short, quick questions, we're happy to answer those. Certainly today's instructor is with a separate consulting company. They get paid for their work, but we can certainly try to answer any quick questions that might come up in relevance, as it's relevant to today's presentation. Today's speaker is Mr. Dr. Michael Couric. He is a partner at BBC, Entrepreneurial Technology Consulting. Let me pull up my bio on Michael. Michael is, again, a partner at BBC, and he's nationally recognized for its expertise in helping technology companies win SBIR and STTR funding. That's BBC. Prior to joining BBC in 2001, Michael held management positions in marketing, sales, and business development for several startup and early-stage companies in industries such as medical devices, informatics, and research tools. Currently, he consults with companies seeking SBIR and STTR funding and has particular expertise in commercialization, market analysis, and business planning. Michael holds a PhD in genetics from Florida State University and an MBA from Boston University. Now with that, I will change presentations over to Michael. If you bear with me. Michael, the screen should be yours, and welcome.
Thank you much, Rob. Thank you very much for the introduction and for that quick overview of SBIR. So today we're going to be focusing, as Rob said, on the project scope, and specifically this this idea of concept of feasibility, which is very important in terms of structuring your SBIR project and setting yourself up for the successful funding for the real development that happens in phase 2 of the project, as we'll see. This discussion is really going to be focused on planning that R&D project, including both setting technical objectives and an important part of that is developing a preliminary budget. And we also have been asked to address this issue of how to handle preliminary data in the proposal itself. So in order to explore some of these concepts, we'll need to do a quick overview of the program, the general outlines of the program, because they bear on expectations from the different agencies and what the proposed projects will look like in order to address those agency expectations. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, we're talking about small business innovation research and small business technology transfer. These are sister programs by which the federal agencies, 11 agencies, have either either one of these programs or both. The idea here is not only to support small business, but to tap into the technological innovation that exists within small businesses and direct those to areas that will have an economic impact. So development of products and services that will eventually reach the market, help those companies to grow with new products and services and create jobs. So at the base of it, economic development, but really harnessing the innovation within small businesses for this for the good of the economy. So in terms of eligibility, a small business is defined as less than 500 employees. The company must be for-profit, located in the U.S., and all of the work on the project itself must be performed in the U.S. That includes consultants and subcontractors that may be part of the effort itself. So part of that eligibility it involves the company itself and its research facilities. Virtual companies are not eligible for SBIR. The expectation is that the companies will have facilities under their control that are appropriate for the proposed project. So you can imagine that the facilities are very important for a company developing a software product versus a company developing a new pharmaceutical, for example. But in either case, the companies are expected to have the facilities and be able to document that those facilities exist. Now, the facilities do not have to be under the company's control at the time the proposal is submitted, but before the money is released and the project can start, the company must have those facilities in place and must be able to document that they have done so. In the proposal, for example, we often see clients that have not yet started actual operations. They will have a letter from an incubator, for example, that says that space will be available contingent on funding of their SBIR project. So the lease doesn't have to be signed. You're not expected to be paying rent when you submit your proposal. But again, those facilities must be available at the time of the project start. You are able to access specialized facilities through a subcontracting arrangement or through a leasing arrangement. For example, sophisticated equipment obviously would not, for most small companies, be available within their facility, but they can negotiate for access through a university or other organization, and that type of access is permitted and would be budgeted either as a subcontract or purchase services, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. Ownership. As I said, the programs are restricted to U.S. companies, and they are defined as majority owned by and independently operated by individuals who are U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So that majority of the company must be owned by U.S. citizens or those who are permanent residents with the ability to work in the U.S. So green card is required for the personnel that would be working on the project. The exception is if the company is owned by another for-profit organization, that organization must meet the requirements for small business. Again, the less than 500 employees and the ownership by individuals, and this exception allows companies that might be owned by venture capital partnerships to be eligible for the programs. So just one slide about the difference between SBIR and STTR. The primary difference is in the relationship with a nonprofit research institution. The SBIR allows you to subcontract or to collaborate with an organization such as a university, but you're not required to. For SBIR, the company can do all of the work and basically spend all of the budget within its on its own employees and materials. The STTR program was set up specifically to encourage collaboration between small business and nonprofit research institutions. Typically, those institutions are universities, but they don't necessarily have to be. They, however, must be nonprofit institutions. So in one case, it's allowed but not required. In the case of the STTR, that involvement is required. However, in either case, the applicant is always the small business, the organization that controls the money for the STTR, the budget, is always a small business. So just to make that clear, the small business is in charge, and the small business is on the hook. If the project is not carried out correctly, the federal agency comes to the small business, not to its subcontractors, to find out what's going on. So SBIR is called a three-phase program. The details of the length of the phases and the budgets for each of the phases are dependent on the agency. There's a lot of flexibility that the agencies have to apply the basic rules to its own situation. But phase one is designed to establish the feasibility of the technical approach that the company is taking to solve a particular problem. Phase two is where the actual development work occurs, and that's typically over a 2-year period with a budget somewhere between $500,000 and $1.5 million, depending on the agency. Phase three is all about commercialization. And basically, you're on your own there in the sense that no SBIR funds can be expended in the phase three. That does not necessarily mean that no federal funds, no agency funds, because it is possible, as Rob alluded to, that the agencies in some cases may be customers for your technology or the products that result, and in that case those agencies may contract with you to continue development or contract to actually supply product to them that was developed during the SBIR. So here's a quick overview of the 11 agencies that we mentioned. Those on the left side of the panel here, the top 5, basically the big 5, have both SBIR and STTR programs. DoD is by far the largest with about half of the total SBIR funding of $2+ billion a year. The Health and Human Services is primarily NIH, so the two, DoD and NIH together, constitute over 80% of the SBIR funds, but NASA, Department of Energy, and National Science Foundation also have significant size programs. If you don't recognize the acronyms, of course, USDA is Agriculture, Department of Transportation, EPA, Department of Commerce, Education, and Homeland Security. Smaller agencies, but maybe not so important the size of the budgets, but what are your chances of actually getting funded by the agencies? These percentages that you see in this slide beside the budget figures represents the success rate of phase one proposals submitted to that agency in fiscal 2011. That's the year that the most complete data were available. And you can see, when I say success rate, I mean the number of awards divided by the number of phase one proposals submitted. So the success rate doesn't correlate exactly with the size of the budget. So obviously an agency with a large budget like DoD attracts many more proposals than a smaller agency. These success rates vary from year to year, and they have been trending down in recent years because of the tightness of the equity markets, and more companies are trying grant mechanisms to sustain their level of funding, and this typically happens when investor capital is tight. Okay, so just some terminology. When I talk about solicitation, the federal agencies typically call these funding opportunity announcements, so FOA is a term you may see, but these are what we understand to be requests for proposals or requests for applications. So the solicitation is the document that comes out from the agency explaining what they expect to see and how you go about preparing and submitting a proposal. And it'll give you information about how they review it and how they inform you of their funding decision. A submission is actually your proposal or your application that is submitted by a deadline specified by the agency. The award is either in the form of a grant or a contract, and these are the mechanisms by which the agencies transfer the money to the small business. Now, you've seen some of the differences on that one page with the budgets between the agencies. There's a lot of other things that vary between agencies. So in a way, this is 11 different programs because in addition to the budgets, the size of their awards, their success rates, the topic areas, the number of solicitations, as Rob mentioned, how they review proposals, how they evaluate them, how you actually submit your application. And when I say level of experimentation, I mean the reauthorization by Congress of the SBIR and STTR programs allowed the agency some flexibility to try some new things. And different agencies are proceeding with that more rapidly than some of the others. So I'll point out when there are new things coming down the pike as we go along here. But one of the important distinctions is that bullet on the top, the type of awards. There's basically two types of agencies. They're either grant-making agencies or contracting agencies. And the difference basically is in the requirements, and for a contract, obviously there's a negotiation up front where there's defined deliverables. It's typically very well defined in what the agency expects to see. They often require more timely reports, possibly even monthly during the course of the project. And most important, the contracting agencies put out very specific topics, and companies are required to respond in their proposals to that topic. They're basically saying these are the problems that the agency is having. Perhaps these are the approaches that we've used to try to solve the problem, but that hasn't really worked. We're looking for more innovative ideas. We're looking for better ideas. So they're looking for a solution to a problem. The granting agencies, on the other hand, have very broad topic areas, and you are, as the applicant, are encouraged to submit innovative ideas within that in that topic area. So it is your job not only to suggest the project, but to define the problem that you're trying to solve and to argue why your approach is innovative. Typically, the granting agencies require a few progress reports. In the case of Phase 1, only the final report at the end of the 6-month project. And you're also allowed to talk to the granting agency program managers anytime. Granting agencies typically evaluate the proposals through peer review. So they recruit experts from the community who evaluate and score the proposals. Contracting agencies, on the other hand, typically use their own scientists and engineers to evaluate the proposals they receive. And that's why the contact with those individuals is limited in order to give everybody a level playing field. As I said, contracting agencies can offer opportunities in Phase 3 through contracts or acquisition arrangements. Typically, the granting agencies have no Phase 3 opportunities in terms of follow-on funding. So here are the breakdown of the between the contracting agencies and the granting agencies. Defense and NASA are the largest of the contracting agencies. Health and Human Services has both contracting and granting, although the contracting is a small part of it. The little note you see there just reflects the fact that one institute at HHS, National Cancer Institute, now uses contracting for 1/3 of its SBIR budget, and that in 2013 amounted to $38 million, which is larger almost twice as large as the entire SBIR budgets from Department of Agriculture and all those agencies you see listed below them on the table here. So the big granting agencies include not only NIH, but Department of Energy, National Science Foundation, and Agriculture. Now, we're not going to be able to talk about all these agencies today in terms of the scope and the structure of the projects, but I will be using several of these as examples. So I'll be using DoD as an example of a contracting agency when we talk about expectation and structuring and planning your project, and I'll talk both about Health and Human Services and the National Science Foundation as granting agency examples. Okay, so let's move into the core of the presentation for today, planning your R&D project, and a very important part of that is this concept of feasibility. What exactly is feasibility? And first of all, let me show you why this is so important. So we've already talked about the three phases, right? So when you think about this development project that you're going to propose, it's best to think of it in terms of 3 years and $1 million plus or minus $1 million project. But the structure of the programs require that you break this 3-year project down into 2 pieces. A phase 1 feasibility, and we're talking about sort of the general guidelines right now for the times and the budgets for each of these phases. As I said, they'll vary by agency, but the guidelines are that a phase 1 SBIR lasts 6 months and has a budget of about $150,000. The phase 2 is, as I said, the bulk of the development occurs there over a period of 2 years with a budget of about $1 million. So this short project, this phase 1 feasibility project, you get a little bit of time and a little bit of money to demonstrate feasibility. What do we mean by that, and why is it important? Well, it's important for a reason that's illustrated on this slide. This is a slide from the Department of Energy, and it shows the outcomes for phase 1 and phase 2 proposals that were submitted in fiscal year 2012. So let's concentrate on the phase 1 proposals first. You'll notice, first of all, that of the 1,733 applications they received, 15% of them were sent back without review. This represents the applicants who didn't follow the rules, who didn't understand what the requirements were, didn't read the fine print of the solicitations in terms of page length and the rest. So this is good for you because you're going to be following the rules, increases your chances of getting funded. An equal percentage of applicants were recommended for funding but did not receive awards, and an equal amount to that recommended for funding and were awarded. So 15% in fiscal 2012, according to this data source, 15% of the phase 1 proposals were awarded. Now, switch your attention to the right side. Look at phase 2. Of the 208 applications that were received, 104, 50%. So in reality, it's easier. You have a higher chance of getting the $1 million funding than you do the $150,000. So this is the competition exists in this phase 1 arena. So structuring your phase 1 and positioning it correctly with the reviewers is key to success in getting your foot in the door. Because once you have your foot in the door by receiving that phase 1 award, you have set yourself up for a very high chance of getting the $1 million funding. All right? So this phase 1 is important. So you've already seen this. Phase 1, basically 6 months, $150,000 to demonstrate feasibility. Phase 2, phase 3, right? Development and commercialization. So let's concentrate on this concept of feasibility. What exactly is feasibility? Well, this gets into us into this difference between contracting agencies and granting agencies. Feasibility for the contracting agencies is pretty straightforward. This slide is an example of 3 different topics that were published in the current Army solicitation. So the Department of Defense currently has an open solicitation on the street. You can download it from their website, and each of the participating components at DoD has listed topics that or problems, if you will, that they want responses in terms of proposals for solving this problem. So in the case of the Army, these are 3 examples of about 70 topics that are listed in theirs, and overall you're probably looking at over 200 to 300 topics in this solicitation. So, and you'll be surprised at the breadth of the technologies that are requested and are funded by Department of Defense. So if you think that may be of interest to you, I'd urge you to get onto the website at DoD, and you can do keyword searches of those topics. You don't have to read all 300 of them. You can put in your key technical terms and see if any of those topics relate to those the technologies that you might have capabilities in. But let's look at these examples first of all. These are paragraphs from those 2 pages or so that describe each of the topics. So they go into quite a bit of detail in generally what the problem is, and then they specify both for Phase 1 and Phase 2 what the Army expects to see as a result of the funding that they may award to a company. So the first one here, they're telling you that the Phase 1 should include modeling of performance of a particular coating and actually experimental testing on small pieces, on small coupons, to test the performance of that coating. So they're being very specific on what their expectations are in terms of the data you're delivering. In the one in the middle, they expect you to develop a proof of concept for in vitro and in vivo models for ricine-specific monoclonal antibodies. It might be unusual to see that kind of a technology under DoD, especially for the Army. All right, but again, proof of concept, in vivo, in vitro models, very specific in terms of the Phase 1 feasibility. Look at the third one. Not only specific in terms of the type of battery, but they're quoting minimum levels of energy density, specific energy, and discharge cycles in terms of the performance of those battery cells, right? And they want you to deliver 5 of these cells for laboratory testing at the end of Phase 1. So my point here is that feasibility for contracting agencies that have very specific topics typically does not require imagination on your side. You certainly have to describe how your project will result and deliver these particular deliverables that are specified. So you want to be responding in detail to what you see described in these topics and the approaches that have been tried already that have not succeeded. So there certainly is a different strategy that is used in your Phase 1 proposals to a contracting agency versus a granting agency. For the granting agencies, you as the applicant are responsible for, 1, establishing the significance of the problem. The granting agencies are not going to describe a specific problem. They're going to give you a broad area of technology that they're interested in seeing new ideas for. Your job is not only to pick out the problem that you're going to try to solve, but convince the reviewers that it's a significant problem, that it's a problem that is significant and important to the agency that you're responding to. So you have to understand the mission of that agency and their expectations. You have to certainly understand the state of the art of that technical field, because you have to describe how and why your approach to the problem is innovative. Why is it different than what's been tried before? Why is it different than what's available right now, either on the market or in development, right? So that falls, all of this falls on you to convince the reviewers that you're addressing a significant problem with an innovative technology. As part of that, it's necessary for you to define what technical feasibility is. They're not going to tell you what the deliverables, what the expectations are for that particular project in terms of the phase 1 results. So you have to define feasibility and then select the appropriate technical objectives to achieve that feasibility, that demonstration of feasibility. And obviously, like the contracting agency proposals, you design and describe the plan of work that you're going to use to reach those objectives. All right. So
Michael, this is Robert.
Yeah,
Michael,
Robert, go ahead.
I hate to interrupt.
No.
In measuring feasibility, you know, there's in both the granting agencies and the contracting agencies. Maybe it's more important in the granting agencies for you to identify how you're going to show that feasibility has been proved. Are you going to talk about different ways of measuring that success? Whether it's,
without a doubt.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think that that is a very important point. It's not only the definition of the feasibility, but what is going to, how are you going to measure success, and what constitutes success in terms of establishing feasibility and achieving certain technical objectives. And we're actually going to move into that in just 2 slides. Okay. So the question now is this idea of what is feasibility. Obviously, from what we've said already, feasibility is project dependent and technology dependent. And that's why the granting agencies with broad topics can't really easily define feasibility when the topics are so diverse. It's up to you. Feasibility for a software development project may be very different than feasibility for a new drug. So what I would suggest to you now is one way of considering this question of feasibility. This is one way for you to approach the development of a definition for your project. So let's start with the idea that you have an innovative technology, and by definition you must have. Otherwise, SBIR or STTR is not the right place for you to be, right? So you've got an innovative technology which by definition is risky. No one's ever tried this approach before. It may or it may not work. As a matter of fact, the agencies that fund SBIR projects realize, the way venture capitalists do, that probably the majority of these great ideas are not going to work. That's this idea of high technical risk that Rob was talking about in the beginning. There's just too much risk for the average investor to put money into these ideas yet. But the government is willing to take that risk. They put a lot of money into the basic research already. They're willing to put a small amount of money now to see if the results of those research investments might pay off in terms of new products and new services. So you're proposing application of technology to real-life problems, and they may work. And if they work, they're probably going to be a major advance in the field or solve a major problem. So they're willing to take that risk. So the projects you're going to propose are risky by definition. Now, I suggest that you imagine yourself sitting down across the table from another technical expert, someone that knows as much about the technology as you do. You can, for this imaginary discussion, you can play the role of Newton or Darwin. You can choose who you want to be here. And as you're explaining your idea, your project idea to this other individual, they're saying, "Oh, very interesting, right? It's very interesting, your idea." But like any good scientist or engineer, they're going to explain to you all the different reasons why it can't possibly work, right? Oh, well, good idea, but of course you already know that it can't work for this reason and for reason B and C and so forth, right? Your job in phase 1 is to generate the data that is required to convince that person to change this attitude of can't work to might work, right? So what do I have to show that person in terms of results? I'm not going to just argue with them and change their mind. I typically have to show them something. They want to see some results, some data that suggest, not guarantee the idea is going to work, but it might work, right? That's what feasibility is. You don't have to go all the way there. As a matter of fact, you probably can't get all the way there with 6 months and $150,000. And $1 million might not be enough funding to get you all the way there to the final product and the final solution. But you have to show that the approach you're going to take, the approach that you're proposing, might work given enough time and money. All right? So that's what feasibility is about. Feasibility typically relates to the innovation, right? That sounds like a no-brainer, right? The innovation is what defines what's most risky, right? If it's different, it hasn't been tried, the reviewers are going to be most skeptical about what's different. Oh, so-and-so has tried that piece of your approach. Oh, yeah, no problem. I think that's going to work. Oh, but this new idea, no. We don't think that's possible, right? So usually this idea of innovation, this idea of feasibility revolves around what's most new and most different, and probably has the less solid basis, solid scientific basis. Other people maybe haven't tried it before. Obviously, there's not a lot of publications on it. Maybe the technology was used to solve a totally different problem, but it's never been applied to this problem in this way. So people are going to be skeptical by nature, right? So as you think about what constitutes feasibility for your project, focus on what's most innovative and think about what can I do in a short amount of time for a little bit of money to generate the data to suggest that my innovation is going to work, my approach is going to work. So you want to identify what type of data will convince the skeptics that the approach is potentially successful. Again, not a slam dunk, right? And this is where your technical objectives come into play, right? Your data can be all kinds of things. It might be modeling. It might be performance data on a prototype product. It might be mathematical calculations, right? There's no sort of single answer to what the project might be. Let me tell you a little story about a client of ours. So the overall project was to develop a new type of redox flow battery. And I'm not even sure I could describe to you what a redox flow battery is, but I did know at one time when this client was describing the technology to me. And the first problem we had before they even started writing the proposal is that, okay, what are we going to do for phase 1? How are we going to establish feasibility? Well, in this area of battery technology, redox flow batteries are typically composed of metals and an electrolyte, vanadium as the first choice. And the innovative approach that this client was using was that all the components of his redox flow battery was going to be made of the same material. And one of the biggest technical hurdles would be what's called energy density. And in his case, the energy, the charge is carried on these polymeric molecules. And if he could demonstrate a high enough level of charge density, then that would suggests that the approach he's taking might be feasible. And as we explored this idea of charge density, he realized that there were two ways that he could increase the density of the charge with his materials and his concept. Either he could increase the number of charges on a single molecule of this polymer, or he could increase the number of polymers that were carried in solution. And he decided that the most likely approach, most likely to be successful approach, was to try to increase the number of polymers in solution. In other words, the concentration of the polymer molecule in the analyte, in the electrolyte. So phase one became increase the concentration, show an increase to a certain level, increase the concentration of the charge-carrying molecule, and that was it. It had nothing to do with batteries. It only had to do with chemistry and increasing concentration, because that technical hurdle was the key to between an approach that might work and one that wouldn't work at all if the charge density couldn't be increased by a certain level. Okay, so that's one example of sort of distilling down your innovation to a question or a technical hurdle that can be approached for a little bit of money, a little bit of experimentation, in a short period of time, right? But it certainly is a sales job on your side, because you've got to convince these reviewers who are evaluating your proposal that your definition of feasibility is correct, and the technical objectives and the work plan that you laid out will test this idea of feasibility. So once we've defined feasibility, once you have defined feasibility in your case, the next job is setting technical objectives. And this is where we're going to get into Rob's comment about how do we measure them. First of all, we've got to distinguish between objectives and activities. And this is an issue that we see all the time, and confusion that comes in all the time. Activities, as the definition implies, are tasks. And tasks make up your work plan. They are performed, they're carried out, and as a result of those tasks, you generate data or results. Objectives are not tasks, they're achievements. Objectives don't yield data. They are what result from the interpretation of the data and the conclusions you draw from that. And they should have measurable endpoints. And that's what when we talk about the objectives, we want to know how to measure them. So when we see a proposal that mistakes tasks for objectives, the tasks are usually the description of the task, the statement of the task usually starts with phrases like, the task is they say the objective is to study or to experiment or to test or to optimize, right? If I can ask you, how do you know when you're done studying? How do you know when you're done testing? That means you're telling me a task. You're telling me how you're going to do it, not what you're going to do. Objectives, on the other hand, objectives, on the other hand, start with phrases like to demonstrate or to prove or to establish, right? So that is the achievement that we're trying to reach, right? So it's important when you state an objective that you also define what we call success criteria, right? How are you going to measure it, and what is the level of achievement that's going to define success or failure? So, for example, your specific objective may be to demonstrate that the methodology that you're proposing for synthesizing a particular molecule is superior than the current state of the art, right? So that's the objective. And the success criteria might be to demonstrate an improvement of 20%, to pick a quantitative target. So if I could show in my phase one that my method as compared to the current method is at least 20% better, I've demonstrated feasibility. But if it only demonstrates 19%, I failed, right? So it's very black and white. There's no interpretation required. At the end of phase one, you're going to present your data with your original technical objective, and the reviewers are not going to have to divine whether you've reached your objective or not. The data will speak, and the data will determine whether you've been successful or not. That is the ideal type of technical objective and success criteria, right? And that's what the reviewers want to see, Rob.
Really quick, and speaking of the reviewers and maybe even the agencies, this is oftentimes where having an advanced discussion with the agency can help you in your earlier stages of figuring out, well, what would be meaningful to them as far as a feasibility success. Meaning you can prove it works better, but if it's only 1% better, well, they're not going to care about that. If it works 10% better, will they care about it? Will it have to work 50% better? And then often in the granting agencies, they're not defining that, so it might help you to have an advanced discussion with them about where because they have other projects they're familiar with that have had, they can maybe let you know whether or not that might be impactful enough for them to want to fund that. Whereas the contracting agencies, if they might actually define some of those things more specifically for you, or not. So again, you might want to talk to them in advance to figure out how much better than the current solutions does it need to be in the measuring ways.
Yes.
So again, those are the kinds of things obviously you want to have something going into those discussions as far as a sort of basic objective, but it's maybe a range, but maybe help pull that out of them through a discussion. Would you guys recommend that?
Well, it's a good point, Rob, and we certainly recommend that you talk to the program managers, whether we're talking about a granting agency or a contracting agency. They often can help you defining the project itself in terms of what is considered feasibility, but also these targets. But surprisingly, what we see is usually not entrepreneurs that don't stretch themselves enough. So arguing that a 1% improvement is great. We see problems on the other side, that entrepreneurs are so optimistic and so wedded to their technology that they overpromise delivery and improvement. So what we advise, and we've had clients tell us that the best advice we ever gave them would be to be more conservative in the phase one success criteria. Because remember, this is just a short period of time and a little bit of money. This product and the process is not optimized. You haven't tested all the variables and massaged it for peak performance yet. That's what happens in phase two when you complete the development or take the development further down the road. So you may expect in the long run that your product is going to be 100% better than what's available now, but 100% is not what you pick for your feasibility target, right? You want to be more conservative there. You want to make sure that you have a very good chance of achieving whatever criteria you lay out in that phase one. Because if you don't, despite having your foot in the door, you're not going to get that phase two funding, right? So be conservative, but you still have to argue that a 20% or a 30% improvement is significant and takes you down the road towards a successful approach to the 100%. So, you have to define your own comfort level there and really be aware of what the state of the art in this technology area is to decide whether 1% is significant or require 30%. And it's good to talk to your technical colleagues to see how they would react to each of those proposed targets. Okay, so in addition to the success criteria now, for each of these technical objectives, we want to develop a preliminary budget for our project, and it's very important. I'll tell you why in a second. But once we've set the technical objectives, think about what resources are going to be needed. How long is each of these tasks, these critical tasks, going to take to complete? And who will perform them? Can we do them inside the company, or will we have to rely on outsiders, either subcontractors or consultants? And where is the work going to be done? So those questions are important, and this is questions about the tasks, right? So the tasks go under the objectives. In order to achieve the objectives, we've got to complete these tasks. What are they going to involve in terms of time and money? So a preliminary budget is very important for a number of reasons. One of those is because I mentioned, implied several times now, that you are allowed to have collaborators and subcontractors for your projects. And there are different guidelines based on Phase 1 and Phase 2, or SBIR and STTR. For a Phase 1 SBIR project, you can subcontract as much as 1/3 of the project budget, right? These can go to outsiders, other firms, big companies, small companies, to universities, wherever you can get that work done. And for Phase 2, up to 50% of the budget can be subcontracted. STTR is a little bit different, but you see it still allows subcontracting to occur. I'm not going to get into the details here, but in terms of the preliminary budget, you're going to define the resources that are required to complete the tasks. That resource might be expertise, it might be equipment, it might be facilities, it might be samples, right? A source of samples for us to test with our new method. So whatever it is, think about where those resources exist. If they don't exist within the company, we now have time to locate them and try to recruit them to our project, right? If we need a collaborator, we've got to convince them to collaborate with us in exchange for a portion of the budget, for sure, but they're going to commit to doing a certain amount of work, right? And now we have to confirm that our project and our expenses meet the budget guidelines. And for that, this is where the preliminary budget comes into play. And let me just show you an example here of the kind of budget I'm talking about. It's not complicated. In this particular example, we've got two objectives. Objective 1 has task A and B, and Objective 2 has one task, task A. For each of those, we've estimated the number of hours that are going to be required to complete. And remember, this is R&D. It never goes exactly the way you have it planned. So we built in some extra hours in there, just if we have to try something different or we have to do something over to make sure we've gotten the result that we're after, right? So we've estimated some hours. We've also decided that we're going to need a consultant, and that consultant is going to have to spend about 160 hours on the project. Okay. We've also decided who is going to do the task. Sometimes it's going to be the company, sometimes a subcontractor or our consultant, and then where they're going to do it, right? So once we know the who and where, in discussions with the subcontractor, in discussions with the consultant, we know what they're going to charge, or can estimate what the charges are going to be based on the number of hours and the task involved, right? So we do a back-of-the-envelope guesstimate of the cost of each of those critical items. The supplies and the other at the bottom there are internal company expenses. For supplies, the other includes your profit on the project and purchase services or travel, things like that the company is going to incur. So our first test is that this budget totals $150,000, which is within the guidelines for a Phase 1 SBIR. Okay, so we're fine there. The next task is to look at the expenses that are going to be incurred outside the company. That includes the subcontract and the consultant. We add those up, $48,000 divided by 150, 32%. So we are within the 33% maximum that we can subcontract, right? So we meet that requirement. Now, if this was 40% instead of 32, now we have several choices. We have to do something, right? So we can go back to our subcontractor and our consultant and try to renegotiate rates, or maybe we have to restructure. Maybe we have to bring some of the tasks inside the company, right? Reduce the amount of work that the subcontractor is going to do, and hire a part-timer within the company to do it. But by doing a preliminary budget at the planning stages, we now have plenty of time to go back and fix things to make them meet the requirements. If we wait till 2 weeks before the deadline and try to do this, we have a very difficult time of restructuring and renegotiating. Okay, so a very important part of this planning. Okay, so now let's move to the last topic, and I think that I want to run through this pretty quickly since I want to leave some time for questions here. This idea of preliminary data. Preliminary data is not required for a phase 1 proposal. You do not have to have preliminary data, but obviously your argument and your proposal is much stronger if you can show some preliminary data. Right? It shows that you have the capability of generating that data. It shows that your particular technology or your approach to the problem has worked in another situation, maybe not the exact situation you're proposing, but it is viable, right? So the question is, well, let me step back 1 second. Many clients ask us, say, well, I have preliminary data, so I've already demonstrated feasibility, so what do I do now? I don't have a phase 1. Well, what you think is data that demonstrates feasibility may not be what reviewers consider adequate data to demonstrate feasibility, meaning either you've done it once or twice, or maybe you've done it 10 times and it's worked twice. Well, there, I showed it can work. Yeah, but maybe you haven't shown up that your approach is robust, that it's repeatable, right? So maybe your phase 1 is to do that particular method with tweaks to show that I can get it to work 9 out of 10 times instead of just 2 out of 10 times. Or maybe there may be other critical parameters that you haven't yet tested. Now, if we change this parameter, does our whole approach fail, or does it make it better? So there may be other key variables in the idea that have to be sussed out and explored in a little bit more depth in the phase 2 to really nail this idea of feasibility, right? So preliminary data doesn't exclude you from having to go through the phase 1 process, right? People are convinced by data, and having deep data and detailed data, granular data is what convinces people that the technology has legs. So if you do have preliminary data, where do you put it in the proposal? So here are for 3 of the agencies just the requirements for the technical proposal in phase 1. This is DoD, maximum 20 pages. I want to show you that these typically start off with the first thing they want to know about is the problem. What's the problem, right? They don't want to hear about your technology. You don't have a chance to tell these reviewers what your technology is and why it's so great until item number 4 here, related work. So this is a perfect place to discuss and describe preliminary data that you have generated using your approach to the problem, right? So in phase 1 for DoD, it would go into this section. For NIH, phase 1 is only a total of 7 pages. So a phase 1 proposal for NIH, HHS is 7 pages. The specific aims is really an executive summary, so you're not going to put your preliminary data there. The approach is obviously the plan of work. Preliminary data doesn't belong there. So your choices are either in the significance section, which is the significance of the problem, and the innovation section, which is why is your approach different. So you can choose to put it in either of those sections. Most likely it would go into innovation as a demonstration of this innovative approach and the type of data that you have been able to generate. That it may make more sense there. But it depends on what the best way of telling the story, the clearest way of telling your story. Sometimes it it's better in the significant section for an NIH proposal. For NSF, it could go in the first section here, identification and significance of the innovation, but you should be talking about the problem first and establishing the fact that it's an important problem. So I would think that the best place for your preliminary data is in the background section. So the background, where does this technology come from? How was it developed? And then leading naturally, what is it produced in terms of preliminary data? And then finishing up with, okay, here is our definition of feasibility, and here are our technical objectives that we're going to achieve in phase 1. So that is a nice flow to that story for section 2 of this NSF proposal. Okay, so just to wrap it up now, a couple take-home messages. I keep telling people it's never too early to start planning, but it's often too late. So start your planning early, early, early. You can go through a lot of iterations, really get to a good plan, good positioning for your phase 1 objective, for your phase 1 proposal. The other thing is understand that planning is critical for funding success. And we're not focused on just funding for phase 1. We want funding for phase 2. That's where the resources are, and that's what you're after. Let your definition of feasibility dictate what those objectives are going to be, because the whole goal here of phase 1 is establishing feasibility. That's all it's all about. And again, as a success criteria, be quantitative, but try not to be too aggressive. Don't let your optimism overtake your reasonableness. Okay. Good luck. That's all I got, Rob.
Thanks, Mike. I got a couple quick comments to help reiterate maybe why you talked about a couple of things there. The budgeting is often important to do ahead of, and as far in advance as you can, after you've thought about the thing, the tasks and objectives you're trying to accomplish, because sometimes it ends up you talked about trying to overdo things, like trying to prove too much things, and oftentimes if you can't pay enough people, the lab space costs too much, or the equipment you need is too expensive, well, sometimes you have to then scale those objectives back a little bit, or just go to one objective instead of you had a couple objectives. So there's different ways to do that, and meaning that you're trying to maybe narrow down what you're trying to prove out in phase 1, as you talked about. So that's why the budget's important as well.
Yeah, Rob, let me comment on that. The new people to SBIR think that the more work that you propose in a phase 1, the more impact it's going to have with the reviewers. But if they see that the work you're proposing cannot possibly be done for $150,000 in 6 months, it just shows you how naive you are as a manager of an R&D project. So it's better to be focused. It's better to be very circumspect about what you're promising to achieve. You're right.
Right, and something we'll get into more in depth when we get to the commercialization planning webinar on January 30th is that the discussion of the actual problem with customers, whether if it's DoD, it's talking to actual people within, if it's the Army and they mention who might be having these issues, you need to become a little bit of a knowledgeable about that specific problem with that specific agency, and that the Department Executive Office that might have that problem. If it's like an Army and then they talk about a problem, and you really need to talk to people who are addressing those problems to understand the level of feasibility and that level of development in the phase 1 that you really need to have. That's where that, not just talking to the agency, the program manager, the technical point of contact at the Army who wrote the topic, but also the other people. So the more knowledgeable you can become about that problem by talking with the customers and the people that want to solve the problem and buy the solution, the better. And obviously with the granting agencies, that's all you have to do. There's no federal agency you need to talk about using it with an NSF grant or an NIH grant, because that's not the purpose of the grant. Its purpose is commercial, so you need to talk about, if it's a solution that's going to lower cancer rates, well, how much lower? And well, who says it? Who wants it? Who's going to buy it? With that much lower, what are they going to pay for it? So you really got to talk to customers to help, again, maybe further identify that feasibility that you're trying to prove and the measurements in there. So something it's, certainly I know you guys talk to companies about, that's almost some of the first things you probably have a discussion on is what the project is and the scope, and trying to narrow that down to a project that's addressable. There's a question that came in and says, if my solution to a problem is an integration of existing systems with demonstrated capabilities, but the components have never been integrated in a particular way before, how do I establish technical risk other than to say that there are always risks in integration?
Well, I think that you asked about risk, but I think what you're saying is, how do I convince the reviewers that it's innovative, right? Mm-hmm. So right. That there is risk involved. If something is just a pure engineering exercise, if I just keep turning the crank here and try different combinations, eventually it's going to work. Most of the agencies are not impressed by that in terms of an innovative approach. However, I got to say that for the contracting agencies, if it will solve their specific problem and it hasn't been tried before, that may be a very viable proposal to make, right? And again, that's where talking to the program manager or the topic manager, topic author at the contracting agencies can be very valuable. But a technology applied to a new problem, your technology doesn't have to be brand new, but it can be applied in a new way and constitute innovation. This is sort of the art of proposal writing. How do you sell the idea that your approach is innovative? So that is a lot of marketing in the sense of creativity, but certainly you want to have solid backup for that from third party, from publications and things like that.
Yeah, and typically when we give training, oftentimes we say that what is not innovation is just integration. Integration, putting A to B together to get C. Yeah, there's some risk, but maybe you're not adding anything else. If you're adding something else to it, you got to create an algorithm, or you have a platform technology that you need to demonstrate this would work within, and there's a risk of it not working. So you have to layer something else on that integration effort to show that there's additional value add at some point, and investigation as to its relevance and feasibility with that additional layer added onto it. Typically, so that's, you have to be careful. In fact, I read proposals for NSF once for phase 1, and whenever they said integrating, I always went, ugh, bad words. Don't say integrate, because they typically are looking for that as the a cheap way in of just saying, I know it works, just give me the money.
Right, and it gets back to the issue you were raised before about, okay, it adds value. Okay, how much improvement are we talking about, right? So NSF says we're not looking for 5–10% improvement, right? We're not looking for incremental improvements. We're looking for game changers. That's the way they state it. But again, different agencies have different expectations.
Yeah, the DoD, as I mentioned to people, what they're, the whole purpose of SBIR in general, all agencies, is innovative, high-risk solutions that have a big payoff. Now, when that gets divided up into each agency and how they work, and agencies that want to buy something in the end because they actually have a real problem, if the only things they funded were these high-risk, really hard-to-solve problems and solutions and ways to go about it, the likelihood of them ever getting any solution or product in the end, it would be lower. So they, by nature, as a user, and want to buy something, they want something that's really cutting edge, but not so cutting edge where the chance of, there's a likelihood of not having anything in the end because no one solution will ever work. They don't like that. They want it, so there's a risk level that's probably a little lower risk than the agencies like NSF and NIH. So what you're trying to prove out, in general, the general scope of the project is going to be different. The risk level is a lot different with an NIH and NSF because they're not going to buy it. So you have to, they're willing to take a bigger chance on a higher, a big home run, so to speak. And that that then trickles down to what you're trying to prove out, what the scope of your project is, what the measurement of improvement and success is going to be, what those specific things that proving feasibility are. So it'll be different. It could, in fact, you might even be a topic at DoD for something that's similar to what you might be doing at NSF, and you could probably change the level of difficulty at both agencies, if you apply to both, if there's something specific that DoD wanted that's also similar to what you can maybe apply for NSF, you can apply to both and maybe have different levels of feasibility that might be easier to get the DoD one, quite frankly. So, but but as we know, you couldn't take both awards to do the same project, so we talked about that last week. Question came in, can you discuss what should be included in a work plan? Now, obviously, we talk for over an hour or so. Well, actually, that's really the crux of it. One of the all-day workshops we had is going through, it's about half of the day, actually, of what goes into a proposal. But as far as the work plan for a the feasibility study part of the project, Michael, do you have any basic thoughts on that? Or, I mean, each agency's got its own little differences there, as you pointed out before.
Well, I think, as I said, when you have the contracting agency with very specific deliverables, you want to put that stick in the sand and just show how you're going to move from where you are right now to that objective, because that's all they're concerned about. So I would be very specific and very focused on their problem. In the case of the granting agencies, where basically you're selecting the problem and the approach, I think that the plan of work has to be sort of hypothesis driven, in the sense that this is the result we expect to get. This is what we expect to prove. Now, you have to convince the reviewers that the experiments as you have them set up will be a test of that hypothesis and would give either a yes or no answer. And that involves some detail in terms of experimental design. What are you going to do? What are you going to compare it against? Right? If I'm trying a new methodology, are you going to run side by side with the existing methodology to show improvement? What data am I going to be collecting? How am I going to compare it? Right? What are my positive and negative controls? How many samples per group? All of that stuff. How am I going to analyze the data? And then how am I going to draw conclusions from that data? That's what the plan of work should involve in a project that's largely experimental.
Yeah, and my last comment on that before we start winding down here is that each agency does have its own rules, and as Michael talked about a little earlier, they all have sort of different requirements and what they want to see. There's a general nature of of what each project looks like, and again, we talk about that a little more depth in the full-day workshops, in which we'll be planning some in the future. And if hopefully you get the chance to maybe consider attending one of those. But certainly, the actual research, the work plan is for most of these projects the larger part of the proposal. Is that correct?
Sure. Yep. Of course.
Yeah. So it's so you showed a little bit about how many pages that is. And NIH, it's the whole proposal itself is what, 7 pages. So a couple. So you only it's like maybe a 4-page work plan there. Or 5, or whatever, and then so NSF it's going to be different because they allow you more room, and DoD they're different. They allow you different like 20 pages, and I think NSF's 20 pages, so they have different amounts that they suggest, and we go over that sometimes in the workshops. Michael, when you guys work with a client, and we'll wrap up here in a second, and I'm not trying to do any particular plug for you guys, but it's typically and I do the same thing. I try to figure out what it is that you're trying to do, and oftentimes you guys are probably more efficient at doing that, as far as really trying to find the first discussions you have with a company that might be thinking about hiring you guys to help with their proposal, is to figure out, is there something there? Is there how there's a way to sort of talk it out in a relatively short amount of time as far with each specific project, because everything is different. It's hard to do generalities here in a webinar, because each project's different. It's IT, it's drug development, it's a device. These all have a different mindset in what can be accomplished in a phase 1 compared to the overall project. So certainly more can be accomplished in the phase 1 project that's involving IT. It's you're doing some software development, or you're validating certain things compared to the drug development or therapy. Very different in what you can actually deliver in at the end of a phase one. Do you guys, in your discussions, is that the kind of thing you guys talk with initially with companies? I know you guys have a sort of a form that's on your website that you suggest they fill out to help validate, define the project a little bit more to help determine if there's a project there. Is that correct?
Well, once we determine that a company's eligible, right? That's the first hurdle. What we want to convince the client, first of all, is that it's not about what you want to do as a company. It's about what the agency wants to get done, wants to get accomplished, right? Because they're your customer in this sense. They're giving you money for a reason that they have. And then the way we start after the discussion, we want you to draft the technical objectives. Once we understand what feasibility would be in the case of your technology, basically the technical objectives will tell us what the project is going to look like. And before you start writing anything, we discuss those technical objectives. Is it right? Is it a good test of feasibility? Blah, 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 all of those issues. And once those are in place, the work plan sort of flows from that. So that's the first hurdle that we get across when we're working one-on-one with a client.
Okay, and as we finish today's webinar up, I just wanted to reiterate, that the objective of today's webinar was to kind of go over a little bit about the project scope and what meant conceptually, what goes into it, and helping you figure out different ways to, depending on what you're doing, what you need to think about as far as project scope. The objective wasn't to help you learn how to submit the whole proposal today. I know there's a couple questions about that came through, and that we talked about the basics of the program in last week's webinar. We have a webinar about commercialization planning, which will be part of any full phase one proposal as well, about where's it going and customers and data. Today was commercialization, a little bit about the feasibility and preliminary data, helping you form the basics of what it is you're trying to do. So we hope we were able to accomplish that. This is the first time we delivered this webinar, so we hope that we could provide some insights that I don't think I've ever seen this webinar given before, or this workshop. We kind of talk about some of this stuff sometimes in the full-day workshops, but we try to piece it out here a little bit. Hopefully it was helpful to everybody. I look forward if you have any comments about that, if it was effective, as it was added to last week's webinar, and also forward thinking to the other webinars we're holding. We're trying to help train you on some of these various small pieces that together add a big part of the program. So we totally encourage you to let us know. I'm going to send out today's slides, and certainly I'll CC Michael on it, so you can all reply to Michael directly and to myself directly. If any questions you may have, we'll try to do our best to answer them in as short amount of time as possible. If you're in Virginia, I would love to chat with you more about when you're identifying an opportunity. If you want any more questions about how to look at the agencies, I'm happy to talk to you and see what we can do to help. And Michael, I'm sure you guys are the same, as try to work with companies. You got just to reiterate, I don't charge any money to work with my clients in Virginia. We have some funding that can help you actually pay to support and hire a consultant like BBC. So if you want to talk to Michael and his team about what they would engage with you on as far as a project, happy to help see if we'd be able to provide some support for that endeavor. So let me know as soon as you can. A lot of opportunities coming up in the coming year. The DoD is currently open. It closes in January sometime. I believe January, right? Yeah. And NIH just closed and NSF just closed. So you have 4 and 6 months respectively there for you before the deadline. So a lot of opportunities in NIH and NSF coming up in the future. So hopefully we can talk to you then. But with that, I want to thank Michael for his time. And again, if anyone has any questions, you can certainly send us an email, and we'll hopefully help facilitate some of this. The most important part here of today's objective was to help you figure out, how do I put together some ideas as far as a scope and feasibility, and hopefully help you start putting pen to paper, so to speak, on that effort, and we can certainly try to help direct you in that direction in any questions you may have. So thank you, Michael. Thank you for everybody who took place today's webinar, and we look forward to hopefully having you participate in the next webinar, which will talk about teaming, small businesses teaming. How do you really make yourself shine, even though you might be a startup, maybe really small? How to use that, the amount you're able to outsource most effectively to help build your team most effectively. So thank you very much, and we look forward to chatting with you soon. Thank you.